For over 6 decades, Cliff Richard dazzled crowds, shattered records, and redefined what it meant to be a British pop star. To the world, he was the clean-cut heartthrob, the eternal bachelor, the man who never seemed to age. But beneath the glitz, the stadium tours, and the ever-present smile, there was a different story, one rarely told and even more rarely understood. Behind closed doors, Cliff lived a life of quiet sacrifice, intense pressure, and solitude. He never married. He never had children. And while the tabloids speculated endlessly, Cliff offered no explanations, only silence. His story isn't just one of fame and fortune. It's one of resilience, faith, and personal cost. Most fans think they know Cliff Richard, but the truth is, the real man behind the icon has always remained just out of reach. And once you hear what he endured, you may never see him the same way again. From empire to exile, the forgotten childhood, Cliff Richard wasn't born in Britain. In fact, his early years were spent thousands of miles away in the fading shadows of the British Empire. Born Harry Roger Webb in Lucknow, India, in 1940, his childhood began in comfort. His father worked for a catering company that served British railways, and the family lived what many would have called a privileged life, complete with servants, sunshine, and stability. But everything changed almost overnight. When India gained independence in 1947, the Webbs, like many Anglo-Indian families, were forced to leave. The empire was collapsing, and with it, so did their place in the world. The family boarded a ship bound for England with barely anything to their name. Their new life in post-war Britain was nothing like the one they'd left behind. Home became a tiny council flat in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire. There was no central heating. Winters were brutal. Cliff would later describe watching his mother weep as she tried to keep the house warm and food on the table. He shared a single bed with his father and younger brother, cramped, cold, and humbling. Gone were the servants and sunny afternoons. In their place came ration books and reality. These early struggles weren't just background noise. They shaped him. As his family clung to each other, Harry began to retreat inward, finding escape not in toys or friends, but in the music playing from a neighbor's radio. Elvis, Little Richard, Buddy Holly. He couldn't explain why, but something about those voices made his world feel bigger than it was. Music didn't just distract him from hardship, it gave him a future. But for Harry Webb to truly step into that future, he had to leave the past behind, starting with his own name. Becoming Cliff Richard, a persona forged in fire. Harry Webb was just a teenager when he made the decision that would change everything. Inspired by the raw energy of American rock and roll, he knew that if he wanted to make it big, he needed more than just talent. He needed an identity that fit the stage. So, Harry disappeared. In his place, Cliff Richard was born, a name sharp enough to sound edgy, yet safe enough to charm the mainstream. But don't let the polished image fool you. Cliff's rise wasn't smooth. In 1958, he recorded Move It, a gritty, rebellious anthem that many critics still consider the first true British rock and roll hit. Radio DJs were shocked. This wasn't the sweet, manufactured sound the UK had grown used to. This was raw, real, dangerous, and suddenly, Cliff was everywhere. But success came with strings. The moment he began to attract attention, the pressure to conform kicked in. Management reshaped his look, softened his sound, and insisted he present the boy next door image, clean, modest, and safe for mums and churchgoers. While his rivals leaned into appeal and controversy, Cliff was told to smile, keep his shirts tucked in, and never stir scandal. The rock rebel had to become a poster boy. He was thrust into the spotlight with a perfectly curated image, but behind it, Cliff was still figuring out who he really was. Fame had arrived, but it didn't ask if he was ready. Still, he played the part. Because back then, if you didn't fit the mold, the industry left you behind. And while fans screamed and records sold by the millions, Cliff was quietly building a double life. One public, one private. A superstar on stage and off stage. A young man carrying secrets the world wasn't ready to hear. And it wouldn't be the last time he'd have to hide part of himself. British rock savior, but not for long. By the early 1960s, Cliff Richard was on top of the world. He'd sold millions of records, starred in films, and even outsold Elvis in the UK at one point. For a brief moment, he was the face of British rock and roll. the clean-cut answer to America's dangerous edge. To fans, he wasn't just a pop star, he was a phenomenon. And for a while, it felt like nothing could touch him. But then came a storm he never saw coming. The Beatles. When the Fab Four exploded onto the scene, the entire music landscape shifted overnight. Suddenly, Cliff's safe, carefully managed image felt outdated. Fans were no longer looking for polished. They wanted raw, real, and rebellious. Cliff had paved the way, but now he was being pushed aside by a new generation of artists who weren't afraid to break the rules. One music critic put it bluntly: Cliff Richard made British rock possible. The Beatles made it matter. The press began to turn on him. Headlines that once praised his success now questioned his relevance. For an artist who had once been untouchable, the fall from the spotlight was swift and deeply personal. But Cliff didn't lash out. He didn't spiral. Instead, he stepped back and turned inward. He began reevaluating everything: his music, his purpose, and most of all, his faith. In the middle of a changing world, Cliff chose something radically different. He got baptized. And just like that, his image shifted again. No longer just the clean-cut pop star, Cliff became the born-again Christian in a world that was becoming increasingly cynical and wild. Fans were stunned. The industry rolled its eyes. But Cliff didn't care. For once, he wasn't playing a role. This time, it was personal. But walking that spiritual path came at a cost. One that would shape the rest of his life. Faith, fame, and losing fans. Cliff Richard's decision to embrace Christianity wasn't a publicity move, it was a turning point. While most pop stars of the 60s were diving into psychedelics and rebellion, Cliff was pulling away from it all. He stopped drinking. He canceled shows that didn't align with his beliefs. And he began recording songs with spiritual themes, sometimes even performing gospel on stage where love ballads used to be. To Cliff, it felt like freedom. But to many fans, it felt like betrayal. The boy they'd adored for his charm and flirtatious pop hits was suddenly preaching about salvation. Concerts changed. Lyrics changed. Even interviews began to sound more like sermons than celebrity chatter. And slowly, the crowd began to shrink. Some fans left quietly. Others were vocal, accusing him of turning his back on the very career that made him famous. The tabloids mocked him. Industry insiders dismissed him. And radio stations began to pass him over in favor of younger, edgier acts. But Cliff didn't flinch. While his peers chased the next hit single, Cliff focused on purpose over popularity. He recorded faith-inspired albums, funded Christian projects, and kept his distance from the party scene that had consumed so many others. It wasn't that he didn't want success. He just wasn't willing to trade himself for it anymore. Still, that choice came with loneliness. As friends in the industry faded or turned away, Cliff retreated into a tight inner circle of trusted companions, rarely seen, rarely discussed. Relationships became a mystery. Rumors swirled, but Cliff never explained, never confirmed, never denied. Because for him, silence was safer than headlines. He had gained spiritual peace, but it came at the cost of pop stardom. And soon, he would learn that even faith couldn't protect him from what was coming next. The price of reinvention and loneliness. By the time the 70s rolled around, Cliff Richard had survived the rise and fall of British rock, a spiritual awakening, and the fading spotlight of a pop icon. But what he hadn't escaped was isolation. He reinvented himself again, trading in the gospel-centered image for a more modern sound, collaborating with new writers, and embracing fresh production styles. To everyone's surprise, it worked. He scored hits again, like We Don't Talk Anymore and Devil Woman. A new generation began to notice him, not as a relic, but as a survivor. But reinvention came at a quiet cost. While Cliff's career was back on track, his personal life was a void few ever truly understood. He was never seen dating publicly. He never married, never had children. In a culture obsessed with celebrity relationships, Cliff remained an enigma. Tabloids speculated wildly. Was he hiding something? Was it his faith? Was it personal trauma? Was there someone behind closed doors he'd never reveal? Cliff refused to play into it. When asked why he never married, his answer was always vague. I've had relationships, but I never felt it was right to take that next step. That was it. No names, no details, just the wall of a man who had built a life on controlling his image. And over the years, that wall grew taller. Even close friends admit they rarely saw him open up emotionally. He was polite, warm, professional, but distant. Some say fame taught him that vulnerability was dangerous. Others say faith became his comfort and companion. But whatever the reason, Cliff Richard became one of the most recognizable yet unknowable figures in music history. He was the man who could fill an arena but often went home alone. And while the world praised his discipline and clean image, few realized the sacrifice it took to maintain it. But even as he kept the world at arm's length, he couldn't keep the world from coming after him. Because soon, the most devastating chapter of his life would begin, not on a stage, but under a cloud of suspicion. Rumors, silence, and the man they couldn't define. For decades, Cliff Richard had defied labels. He wasn't the wild rocker. He wasn't the scandal-plagued star. He wasn't even the romantic heartthrob people imagined, because he never allowed anyone to get that close. And yet, in the absence of answers, the world filled in the blanks. Whispers about Cliff's personal life began as early as the 1980s, but in the 2010s, everything exploded. In 2014, Cliff's home was raided by police, triggered by a single and proven allegation from decades earlier. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't charged, but the damage was instant. The BBC filmed the raid from a helicopter before Cliff even knew he was being investigated. Cameras showed officers entering his private space. His name splashed across headlines worldwide. Overnight, his legacy was clouded in suspicion. Cliff was blindsided. He called it the most frightening thing to ever happen to me, and said it felt like the world no longer cared about facts, just accusations. The case dragged on for years, and although authorities ultimately dropped it without charges, the stain never fully lifted. The public had questions, the media had stories, and Cliff had no way to undo the damage. He sued the BBC and won, a rare victory in a system that rarely favors the accused. But even then, something had changed. He became quieter, more guarded, more withdrawn from public life. Interviews grew rare, appearances more selective. Even longtime fans began to admit they didn't know who Cliff Richard really was anymore, or if they ever had. But maybe that was always the point. For all the songs, the stadiums, and the smiles, Cliff Richard's true masterpiece might have been the carefully constructed image he built and protected across generations. A man shaped by fame, redefined by faith, haunted by silence, and never fully understood. And in the end, maybe that mystery is what kept him standing long after so many others fell. An icon built on silence, not scandal. Sir Cliff Richard's journey is unlike any other. A life marked not by reckless rebellion or scandal, but by quiet strength and steadfast dignity. Through decades of fame, he never let the glare of the spotlight consume him. Instead, he chose silence over spectacle, resilience over resignation. He faced the highs of chart-topping success and the crushing lows of public suspicion. Yet through it all, Cliff remained unbroken. His story teaches us that true greatness isn't defined by controversy or headlines, but by the grace with which one carries both triumph and trial. In a world hungry for scandal, Cliff offered something rare, a legacy built on integrity, faith, and an unyielding commitment to his art. He didn't just sing to the crowds. He touched the hearts of generations with a voice forged in hardship and hope. And though the world may never know every corner of his private life, what shines brightest is the man who kept his soul intact, no matter the storm. So, when you think of Sir Cliff Richard, remember this. He is an icon not because he sought fame, but because he endured it with honor. A reminder that sometimes the loudest stories are the ones told in silence.